The Rosary is the most prayed devotion in the history of the Catholic Church. Hundreds of millions of hands have moved through those beads across the centuries, and most of the people holding them have never stopped to ask what they are actually doing. Not what they hope they are doing, not what they believe on faith they are doing. What is literally, mechanically, actually happening on the other side of that prayer every single time those words leave their lips. Padre Pio saw it. He watched it happen for 50 years. And what he described, in confessionals, in letters, in the things he whispered to the friars who served with him at San Giovanni Rotondo, does not match what most people picture when they imagine someone sitting quietly with a rosary in their hands. What he saw looked like warfare. What he saw looked like fire crossing enormous distances without losing any of its heat. What he saw looked like chains being cut, one bead at a time, in the darkest rooms of the invisible world. He was not being poetic. Padre Pio spent decades watching things that no one else in the room could see. His spiritual sight wasn't a gift he cultivated or controlled. It came to him the way a smell reaches someone, present, specific, impossible to ignore. He saw souls when he looked at people, not their faces. What was actually happening inside them. He saw what entered the confessional with the penitent and what left behind them after absolution. He saw the angels that stood at the entrance of the church during Mass, and the things that gathered at the edges of the monastery's property at night, testing the walls. And he saw, more clearly than almost anything else in that invisible world, what happened when someone prayed the Rosary. Not the feeling of the prayer, not the peace it brought to the person holding the beads, the actual movement it caused, the concrete, specific, mechanical effect of each bead and each decade on the souls it was directed toward. What he witnessed across those years reshaped everything he taught about prayer, and those who knew him well said that no spiritual subject drew more emotion from him than this one. He would speak about it with the kind of urgency that only belongs to someone reporting something they have personally seen, not read about, not been taught, not inferred, seen. The first thing you would notice, if you could stand in the invisible world while someone prayed the Rosary, is that the prayer has a shape. It is not just words going up and dissolving into silence. It moves. It has direction. It has force. A single Hail Mary, spoken with even partial attention, leaves the lips of the one praying and crosses something. Like a stone thrown across still water, it does not stop when it leaves the hand. It travels somewhere specific. Padre Pio described the Rosary, in ways that those who sought his counsel remembered for the rest of their lives, as something like a rope. Not the kind of rope that comforts you by being there. The kind of rope you use to pull something. When a person knelt and began the first decade, that rope stretched outward through the invisible world and wrapped itself around whatever the prayer was aimed at. If the prayer was for a soul, a son who had walked away from the faith, a dying man fighting off the priest at the door, a woman whose heart had gone cold over years of grief, the rope found that soul. It did not need the people to be in the same room. It did not need the soul's cooperation. It did not need the person being prayed for to believe that anything was happening to them. Grace, in Padre Pio's understanding, does not ask permission to approach. It only asks the one reaching to keep reaching. The beads are not decorative. Each one is a knot in that rope. Each Hail Mary tightens the line. Each completed decade draws the grace closer to the soul it is seeking. Those who heard Padre Pio speak of this said his voice carried the weight of someone reporting something he had seen with his own eyes. Because he had. And this is why he never told people to pray the Rosary quickly, to rush through it, to simply finish it. The knots need to hold. There is something else you would see, standing in that invisible world while the Rosary is being prayed. You would see what the grace is pressing against. The Catholic tradition has always taught that dark forces work against the salvation of souls. But that phrase can slide off the mind without leaving a mark. What Padre Pio witnessed was not abstract. It was specific. It looked like something solid, a wall built from the accumulated choices of a lifetime, reinforced by year after year of closed doors and covered ears. Not evil in the way a weapon is evil, more like the absence of light prolonged so long that the darkness had become structural, had become home. This is what the grace from the Rosary meets when it arrives at a hardened soul. But the grace does not negotiate with that wall. It does not argue with it or try to go around it. It finds the thinnest place and presses. And with every bead, with every word spoken into the silence, the pressure increases. Not in a way the person praying will feel in their hands, not in a way the soul at the other end will notice yet, but in the world Padre Pio could see. The pressure was real, and it built. He could tell, those around him said, when someone was coming to him with prayers already bearing fruit they couldn't see yet. He could see the crack in the wall that the faithful rosaries had already made. And this is why the people who came to him in the most impossible situations, a father who hadn't entered a church in 40 years, a brother who had publicly denounced God, a husband whose contempt for faith had become the architecture of a marriage, he told them all the same thing. He pressed a rosary into their hands the way a surgeon presses a tool into a hand before a long operation. Not a comfort, a prescription. There is a moment inside the praying of the Rosary that Padre Pio understood as the most important one. It is not the beginning, when the intention is freshest. It is not the final decade, when the relief of nearly being finished carries its own energy. It is somewhere in the middle, around the third decade, when the words have become so familiar that the mouth moves almost without effort, and the mind, freed from the work of remembering what comes next, goes genuinely quiet. That interior silence is not emptiness. It is not the mind wandering. That silence is the opening. What the spiritual sight Padre Pio carried showed him was this: the moment the person praying stops thinking about praying and simply prays, the moment the self steps out of the way, the rope stops being pulled by effort and begins to be pulled by something underneath effort, something that does not tire, something deeper than intention. In the invisible world, this looks like a change in the quality of what is pressing against the wall. The pressure moves from the surface of the stone to somewhere closer to its center. The grace finds a way through the thinnest place in a way it couldn't before. It is the difference between a hand pushing and a root growing. One tires, the other doesn't. This does not feel like anything from the praying person's side. The third decade of the Rosary feels exactly like the second, but in the world Padre Pio watched with his own spiritual sight. That moment looked like the first crack of light appearing at the edge of something that had been dark for years. He wept during the Rosary. The friars who prayed alongside him at San Giovanni Rotondo described it. This enormous man, marked with wounds in his hands and feet and side, holding his beads in a grip so tight that his knuckles sometimes whitened, tears running down his face while the words moved through him. Those who watched him assumed it was devotion to Our Lady. It was something more specific than that. He was watching what the prayer was doing, and what it was doing, apparently, was not easy to watch without being moved. Now consider what each Hail Mary does in the invisible world, not as a symbol, as an action. Every Hail Mary is a summons. It calls Mary's attention, specific, deliberate, personal attention, to the thing being asked for. And her attention, in the understanding of the Catholic mystical tradition, is not a passive thing. It moves. When a mother turns her gaze toward her child's suffering, something changes in the room. When that mother happens to be the one through whom grace entered the world in the first place, the movement of her gaze carries a weight that reshapes what she looks at. Padre Pio's relationship with Mary was not a devotion the way a person might collect devotions, by everything he described and everything the friars who lived alongside him witnessed. She was someone he encountered, someone present the way a person in the same room is present. And when someone prayed the Rosary, He understood each Hail Mary not as a new petition sent to someone far away. He understood it as the tightening of a connection that already existed, something alive being asked to act. The Rosary does not build a relationship with Mary from nothing. It wakes up a relationship that is already there. It puts a living reality to work on whatever the person praying is carrying toward it. This is the reason Padre Pio never dismissed the Rosary as a prayer for simple people, as a lesser devotion for those without the education for higher forms of prayer. The simplicity is the point. A child's hands can hold a rope and pull. The power is not in the complexity of the grip. The power is in what the rope is connected to on the other end. You do not need to understand the mechanism. You need to do it. Before we go any deeper into what the Rosary does, consider the man who claimed to see it doing these things. Padre Pio was not a mystic in the way that word gets used casually. Someone sensitive, someone spiritual, someone who prays a great deal and feels things strongly. He was a man who suffered in his body every day for 50 years. The stigmata he carried were not symbolic. They bled. They were examined by doctors who had no explanation for them and verified by the Church after decades of scrutiny. He slept 2 or 3 hours a night. He spent the rest of his hours in the confessional, in the Mass, in prayer that was not peaceful but combative, wrestling, visibly, with things that no one else in the room could see. The friars who served with him described something particular about the way he prayed the Rosary. He did not pray it the way a person performs a devotion. He prayed it the way a soldier fires something. His attention was specific. His face was focused on a point beyond the room. And when he finished, he would sometimes sit very still, as if waiting to see something land. This is the man whose vision of the Rosary we are considering. Not a theologian's theory, not a beautiful spiritual interpretation. The report of someone who watched the prayer work from the inside of the invisible world. The mysteries of the Rosary are not reflections on distant historical events. They are doors. When a person moves through the joyful mysteries, they are not simply remembering the Annunciation or the Nativity. They are entering those events in a way that the invisible world recognizes as real. The grace attached to the Incarnation, the moment God became flesh, is not locked in the past. It is alive, and moving through those mysteries with a soul in mind carries that specific grace toward that soul. The sorrowful mysteries do something different, something sharper. When a person moves through the agony in the garden, the scourging, the crowning with thorns, the carrying of the cross, the crucifixion, they are not contemplating suffering. They are pressing those specific events of grace against the soul they are praying for. The grace that Christ sweated in the garden is the grace that breaks open a soul too proud to ask for help. The grace of the crown of thorns is the grace that reaches into humiliation and makes something holy out of it. Padre Pio understood suffering with a directness that most people never have to develop. He carried wounds in his body for 50 years. And he knew that the sorrowful mysteries, prayed for a soul in crisis, carried a kind of grace that the lighter prayers could not reach. Some cracks in the wall only open under a specific pressure. The suffering mysteries provide that specific pressure. The glorious mysteries carry something else entirely, a quality of light, of finality, of victory already accomplished, pressing backward through time toward a soul that has not yet chosen it. These mysteries prayed for the dying carry a particular weight, because they press the grace of resurrection against a soul that stands at the edge of its own death. They say, in the language of the invisible world, this is what is on the other side. This is what you are moving toward if you open the door. Padre Pio prayed all 5 mysteries every day. He did not treat them as repetition. He treated them as 5 different instruments played on the same wall, each one finding a different frequency, each one loosening something the others could not. Now consider what the Rosary does at the deathbed, because this is where Padre Pio's vision of the prayer became most specific and most urgent. Among the crowds that gathered at San Giovanni Rotondo in those years after the war, There were always those who came with dying family members in mind. A mother whose husband lay in a hospital across the country, too far for her to reach. A son whose father had not spoken God's name in 30 years and was now fading. A wife whose husband had told a priest, at the door of his room, to leave and not come back. To all of them, Padre Pio said the same thing. Do not leave the Rosary. Pray it until he breathes his last. Not because the prayer changes God's mind. That is not the nature of the problem. The problem is the wall. The problem is the soul that has built, over decades, a resistance so thick that ordinary mercy cannot find the crack. And the Rosary prayed by someone who loves the dying person, prayed with the full weight of that love pressed into each bead, does something to that resistance that nothing else seems to do in the same way or at the same depth. Those who lived alongside Padre Pio carefully passed on something he described about deathbed conversions, the kind that no one present could have predicted. He called them the most dramatic spiritual events he ever witnessed. Not dramatic the way a crisis is dramatic. Dramatic the way a birth is dramatic. Something enormous forcing its way through an opening that should not be large enough for it to pass through. In the last moments of a hardened life, the wall does not simply fall. It tears. And the Rosary prayed by the people outside that room, sometimes in a church miles away, sometimes just in the corridor, is what puts the final pressure on the tear. He told a woman once, and those who were present at the conversation described his tone as the kind that makes you remember every word, that her husband had died in a state of grace. She had not been at his bedside. She was in a church, on her knees, moving through the beads while he died in a room hours away. She came to Padre Pio convinced that her prayers had failed, that she had not been there, that she had done nothing. He held her rosary in his hands for a long moment. Then he told her, "The rope does not need the people to be in the same room." There is one more thing that Padre Pio understood about the rosary. Something so specific that it separates his understanding from the general encouragement to pray it. He believed, and those who prayed alongside him saw evidence of this belief in how he lived, that a rosary prayed for someone never fully expires. A completed rosary, offered faithfully for a particular soul, does something permanent in the invisible world, something that holds its position. The soul can continue to refuse grace for years. The wall can appear unmoved, but the terrain around that soul has changed. Something is closer to it now than it was before the prayer, and every subsequent rosary adds to what is already there, building a pressure that has no ceiling and no expiration. This is the piece most people never consider. They stop praying because they see no results. They assume the prayer faded, that God moved on to other business, that they waited too long or prayed too little. Padre Pio would have looked at that assumption the way a man looks at someone who puts down a rope halfway across a river. The rope is not gone. The distance already crossed is not erased, but the soul is still on the other side of the water, and the hand that was pulling just let go. He spent years, sometimes the full span of another person's life, praying for souls that had not yet responded. He did not measure the rosary's effectiveness by visible results. He measured it by what he could see, which was always more than what anyone praying in that moment could see. This is the deepest thing Padre Pio understood about the rosary. The thing that changes everything about how you should hold those beads. Prayer is not local. It does not obey geography. A Hail Mary spoken in a small church in the south of Italy can be working on a soul dying in a city the praying person has never visited, in the heart of someone they have never met, because love does not need proximity to move. Grace does not need the people to be in the same room, the same country, or even the same decade. The invisible world does not work by geography. It works by love. And love, in Padre Pio's experience of what lies beneath the surface of everything we can touch and measure, is not a feeling. It is a force. It moves. It finds. It does not accept distance as a reason to stop. This is not a comfort. It is a commission. There are rosaries being prayed right now for people who have no idea they are being prayed for. People who would laugh at the thought. People who have spent years building exactly the kind of wall that Padre Pio watched grace press against day after day, decade after decade, bead by bead. And in a world they have decided does not exist, a rope is moving toward them. The pressure on the thinnest part of their wall is increasing with every decade a faithful person completes on their behalf. They don't feel it. They may not feel it for years. But Padre Pio saw what happens when years of faithful rosaries finally find the crack wide enough. He described it once, and the description passed between those who heard it the way fire passes between candles, carefully, so it wouldn't go out. As a man walking out of a prison he built with his own hands, not because someone broke the door down, because a rope had been pulling it from the outside for so long that, finally, even the hinges gave way. And at the door, always, was the one who had been praying. What does this mean for the person who has a rosary and hasn't picked it up in months? Or the person who prays it faithfully and feels nothing, sees no results, watches the person they are praying for drift further away instead of closer? It means you are holding something that Padre Pio watched cut chains. Not eventually, not conditionally, not only for people with extraordinary faith and no doubt. Every time faithful hands moved through those beads with a soul in mind, something happened in the invisible world that could not be made to unhappen. The prayer lands. It changes the terrain. It does not dissolve. He did not hand desperate mothers consolation. He handed them something to do. He handed them a tool he had personally watched work, in the world underneath this one, in ways that left him weeping in the middle of Mass and gripping his beads until his hands went white. And the one condition he pressed harder than any other was this: faithfulness, not perfection of attention, not the rosary prayed with extraordinary feeling, not the rosary prayed without distraction or fatigue or doubt, just the rosary, prayed, every day, because the wall does not fall to one blow. It falls to 1,000 patient ones, and each bead is a blow that lands whether the person praying can feel it or not. Padre Pio picked up his rosary before dawn every morning for most of his adult life. He prayed it with wounds in his hands and blood on his habit, and the weight of the previous day's confessions still pressing on him. He prayed it for people who were already dead. He prayed it for people who had not yet been born. He prayed it for souls he had glimpsed in his spiritual sight, who had no one else praying for them, drifting in the invisible world without a rope attached, without a single knot drawing them toward where they needed to go. He prayed it because he had seen, with his own eyes, what it does. And now you have seen something of what he saw, not the whole of it. The whole of it belongs to a world that words can only point toward, never fully enter, but enough to understand why he called the rosary a weapon. Enough to understand why he pressed it into every desperate hand that reached for him across the years. Pick up the beads, not for the feeling, not for the peace, for the soul at the other end of the rope, who is running out of time and does not know yet that a door is slowly, bead by bead, being opened for them. The wall has a crack, the grace is pressing, and somewhere, in a world directly underneath this one, a rope is moving towards someone who has no idea it is coming. And at the door, as always, stands the one who refused to stop praying.